All right, greetings everyone. I think we are ready to start and ready to talk about this very exciting development, which I imagine most of you have heard some rumors about, if not are pretty well informed about. And that's really the purpose of us having this webinar today is to make sure that you have all the information that we have about this historic development. And as you know, it has been a long climb to get here. I mean, I'm a little breathless from the altitude, actually. And want to give you a little bit of background on how we got here and what we know now. And we've got the expert in the room, that is Dr. Richard McKeon, who I'll introduce shortly. But I just wanted to say a few words, if I could, about this historic achievement. It's an achievement in some respects, really, that we all share in. Two things happened when the FCC assigned 988 to SAMHSA and the Lifeline that were completely historic, unprecedented milestones. The first one is that establishing a 3-digit number that is not an N11 number, that is outside of the scope of those 8 possibilities from 211 to 911, because they had all been assigned. The FCC said, we're going to go outside of this usual scope, these limitations, and break the mold for the purposes of suicide prevention and establish this area code-like number, which was actually not an area code, but looked like one, to do something, again, that they had never done before, again, for suicide prevention, which I think to have the federal government at the highest level of communications recognize the importance of suicide prevention, the mission that we all share in, is very heartening and inspiring. The other milestone, the unprecedented thing that happened when they assigned the 3-digit number to SAMHSA and the Lifeline, is never before has a 3-digit number been assigned to a central administrator. As you probably well recognized, whenever you dial 211 or 911 or 311, it goes to a very specific in-state or in-county or in-district recipient facility. This is the first time that they've sent it to a central administrator, with the idea that the central administrator could help create not only uniformity of quality of care, but also route in innovative ways in the event that there were blackouts or problems in various areas of the country, or there were surges, to enable every call to be answered. So those two things the FCC did for the sake of suicide prevention, and making that a priority that the FCC perhaps had never really recognized to that extent before. But one of the reasons that they recognized it as a priority was because there was a report that was given to them by SAMHSA that was written by the esteemed gentleman in this room, Dr. Richard McKeon, who assembled not only from his years of experience and years of advocacy and years of understanding about the needs of crisis centers and suicide prevention, but also talking with a lot of other experts and people such as you all, to put together a report that he provided on behalf of SAMHSA to the FCC that was very persuasive to them. And I think for many of, and it was cited throughout their decision in their report as why 988 should be designated to SAMHSA, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So it is absolutely my pleasure to introduce to you somebody that we truly do know and love, Dr. Richard McKeon from SAMHSA. Richard.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be talking with all of you today. And as John said, there's one purpose, of course, is to make sure that about where we are and what we expect to happen in terms of next steps with implementation of 988. But the second reason that is just as important is we really want to hear from you. And so, questions, but also unprecedented challenges for us. And as we move forward, that we hear from you about the challenges, the opportunities, the discussions that you are having internally. So I got a message that my audio is cutting in and out. Oh, now it says we're okay. Okay, so we'll do our best. Worst comes to worst, I'll find another place in the house to see if there's better reception. But what I was saying is that it's really important for us to hear from you, as well as from other stakeholders, about how you think 988 really should look in your communities, in your states, what you would want to see it look like, what you would need to be able to accomplish that. Because there are a number of things to keep in mind, which is, will the 988 number be a vehicle for more people to contact the existing Lifeline structure? Or can 988 play the same kind of transformative role for mental health crisis services in America that 911 has played for emergency medical services? So there are some really important questions, and people have weighed in different ways. Of importance is that the FCC's order does not limit 988 to suicide prevention only, although suicide prevention is clearly at the heart, at the center of of this effort. But it's also described as a mental health crisis line. Of course, all of you. And so just go over a couple of things for those of you who are not able, who have not been following it as closely. I see another message that I'm fading in and out. John, it might be better for you to take over, since I don't have a way of knowing that I'll be able to be heard consistently.
Richard, and while I'm doing that, feel free to find another area of the house where you think you've historically had better reception. Because again, I think people would love to hear from you as much as possible. But I can give you a little bit of the history of the number, and you, again, mentioning that it was unprecedented. There's two ways to think about it. There's the history of where the idea of having a 3-digit number, which initially was thought to be an N11 number, or should be an N11 number. It actually came from Utah. Certainly, if there's some folks from Utah who are participating in this webinar, you know the story really well, but it really started with a couple of state legislators for Utah, Dan Thatcher and Steve Eliason, who really were devoted to suicide prevention and wanted to establish, I think at that point they were pushing for 611 to be the number for Utah for their suicide prevention efforts. And we've heard really over the years quite a number of whether it's county mental health directors or city mental health directors, the state mental health directors have floated this idea. Why can't we have a number like 311 or something like that for a suicide prevention line? And so that was the idea that was pitched in Utah. Of course, unlike all of the other circumstances where state or county or city mental health authorities had this notion of a 3-digit number, and when they heard that, well, you can't really do that locally, you can't have it all established for suicide prevention unless the FCC does it. Most of them just shrugged their shoulders and said, well, yeah, I guess we can't do that. But not Steve and Dan in Utah. When they heard, you can't do that, they decided to talk with Orrin Hatch, the famous legendary senator from Utah, and said, what do you think about having a 3-digit number for suicide prevention nationally? And Orrin said, that's a great idea. And they also enlisted Chris Stewart, who is from the House of Representatives from Utah. And that congressman and Orrin Hatch together put together the suicide hotline. I think it was called the Improvement Act then, I'm not sure. But Richard, I want to see if you can take it over from here. That's how they came up with a 3-digit number idea as it was pitched in Congress, but that isn't necessarily how they came upon 988. So you may want to talk a little bit about that as opposed to why not an N11 number, and then if you could say something about what's the difference between what the FCC is able to do and what Congress can do.
Okay, I'll give it another try, John. So if I'm cutting in and out, somebody send it in the chat and we'll give it back to John. So the National Suicide Hotline Improvement Act called upon SAMHSA and the VA to make reports to the FCC regarding the advisability and feasibility of a 3-digit number for suicide prevention. And then for the FCC in turn to make a report to Congress making recommendations regarding a 3-digit number. So SAMHSA and the VA did that. The VA's role really focused on whether the existing structure was good for the VA, good for veterans rather, and whether a 3-digit number could help. SAMHSA's role was also to talk about the effectiveness of the existing National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So we provided information based on the groundbreaking evaluations of Dr. Gould and Dr. Califat and Dr. Mashara, et cetera. But we also weighed in explicitly on the notion of a 3-digit number. And what SAMHSA said was that, and this is actually quoted in the FCC's final order, that in our view, a 3-digit number could have a transformative effect on crisis intervention and suicide prevention in the United States if the implementation of such a number was accompanied by increased community capacity to answer the crisis calls that we would expect, because the whole idea of the 3-digit number is that easier to remember, more people will call. And so based on the idea that there would be increased call volume, there needed to be increased call capacity. So that was one of the major things that we emphasized when we, in our report, supported the use of a 3-digit number. The FCC then made their report to Congress and recommended the use of the number 988. I won't get into detail about why 988 versus one of the N11 numbers. And then they issued a draft guidance, a proposed rule, which the telecommunications industry, crisis centers, all kinds of folks, anyone for that matter, had the ability to make a public comment on. The FCC then reviewed all those comments about all the questions, including whether the 988 number should point to the lifeline or whether it should be decentralized in the way that 911 is. And it came to the conclusion that 988 should be the number that should be utilized, and that 988 should point to the existing lifeline system. So just about a month ago, on July 16th, the FCC issued their final regulation, giving a 2-year deadline, July 16th, 2022, for 988 to be made operational all across the United States. And so this applies to every landline, every cell phone provider, every voice over internet provider. However, it is important to know that that doesn't mean that on July 16, 2022, the FCC will flip a switch and everything will go live on that date. It's actually more complicated than that because the providers can begin to make it operational at any time from now until July 16, 2022. The FCC did include in their final regulation a recommendation that providers who are going to make 988 operational early coordinate with SAMHSA, with the Veterans Administration, and with the FCC. Now, in fact, there are, we know that 2 voice over internet providers have already made 988 operational. One that has subscribers in Los Angeles and Sacramento. It's not big, it's a group called Sonic. The other is one in South Dakota. And in fact, the only reason we were aware of it is because the local Lifeline Center helpline in South Dakota let us know about it because a family member of someone at the crisis center got an advertisement from the voice over internet provider that told them about it. So, 99.99% of the country does not have access to 988. But as we get deeper and deeper into this 2-year period, some of them will start to turn on. So we're going to be monitoring that closely, and we will be, communicating with you about that, as we learn about those developments. Now, of course, making it operational in a given system won't necessarily mean an increase in volume. The thing that's really going to drive an increase in volume is communications and publications and promotion of the number. So we will stay in contact with you because this will evolve over the next 2 years, and we think that it will, probably increase in intensity over that period of time. Part of the reason that they didn't give just like, let's say, a month window that implementation had to take place between, let's say, June 1st and July 16, 2022, is that the different telecom providers have very different challenges in making it operational. So for cell phone providers, it's pretty straightforward. It's also pretty straightforward for voice over internet providers. But for landlines, particularly the ones that don't have the latest hardware, the switches need to have physical changes made. So that is, and that's going to take time, and that'll happen sequentially in different places. There also are places that don't, while 988 was chosen in part because there's no 988 area code. There are some exchanges that start with 988. So that would be if you lived in a community where to make a local phone call, you don't need to include your area code and you can just do the first 3 digits. There are some of those that start with 988. And so those are going to need to be switched to being able to have transformed into a 10-digit number so that 988 calls that are meant to be local calls don't go into the Lifeline. So those are some of the reasons that the FCC felt that the implementation couldn't be at one time or in one short period of time, that it was going to have to happen sequentially. So that's important. And so if your crisis center learns that 988 is active in a particular area, Please see if you can let us know how the caller heard about 988 and the telecom provider that directed their call, if you can. Of course, in some circumstances, you're not going to be able to do that if it's a real high imminent risk situation. But contact the Lifeline communications team if you do learn that. Okay, thanks. Why don't we go to the next slide? Okay, now let me just talk about a couple of other things before we go into discussion. We talked about the role of the FCC, the role of Congress. I'm going to let John update about pending congressional legislation. It's better for John to do than for me to do for a couple of reasons. No federal official can take any position on any pending federal or state legislation. And of course, this is informational only. For you. There are discussions in Congress currently. But let me make this point regarding the role of the FCC versus the role of SAMHSA versus the role of the Veterans Administration. And the three of us, FCC, SAMHSA, VA, we have phone calls every 2 weeks monitoring this process. But the FCC's role is now really dealing with the telecommunications industry. They've done the regulation, and now they'll monitor implementation from the standpoint of everyone coming in compliance with their order. But the other piece to it, and the piece that is of particular importance, of course, for you all, is the readiness for being able to answer those calls, particularly as call volume increases, which we would expect that it would do steadily over time. So that's one of the reasons it's important for us at SAMHSA to hear from you, to know your thoughts, to be able to answer your questions if we can, to know what you would like to see. I was able to be on one call with the Mental Health Commissioner of Colorado and other key folks in Colorado regarding issues around 988 implementation. I recently got an invitation from Bart Andrews at BHR asking if I could join a call they were having in Missouri. Happy to do that. The more that we're able to have these conversations, and particularly in this first year, then I think the better off we will all be. John, before we head into questions and answers, why don't you give folks a quick update on congressional legislation? Again, with the caveat, nothing is passed. And, if you observe legislation in the Congress, nothing's ever done until it passes both House and is signed into law by the president. So keep that in mind. But there are discussions and action that's taken place. So John, go ahead and brief folks on that.
Sure. There's a couple of bills, one in the House, one in the Senate. As Richard mentioned, there's the National Suicide Hotline Improvement Act, which was completed in 2018 with the designation of 988, but that was soon followed on the heels by Chris Stewart and Seth Moulton bill, which related to the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act. And that was coming out of, again, the House. Now coming out of the Senate was a Senator Cory Gardner and Tammy Baldwin bill, which was also called the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act. And now those bills mirror each other. So there are no differences between these pending bills. And again, I want to underscore what Richard is saying is that they are pending. They're not a sure thing. So far, they have enjoyed bipartisan support. But obviously, these are very political institutions, and anything can happen as we approach an election period. So again, all uncertain. But I can tell you what they say, and what would happen if, in fact, they were passed and signed into law by the president. The first thing is that it would designate 911, or 988, which has already happened. So that's actually one facet of the Designation Act, ironically, entitled the Designation Act, that the Designation Act really wouldn't need to do. but it's the other things that the designation act would set into motion that I think would be of greater interest to many of us who are really concerned about infrastructure and infrastructure build behind this new 3-digit number. The next thing that this a section or a clause in the Designation Act would require SAMHSA and the VA to come together and provide a report that would be submitted to Congress at 6 months, 180 days after the passage of the legislation, to provide a report about the infrastructure needs, costs, operations, requirements, et cetera, et cetera. And again, that would be a 6-month period from the day in which it was signed into law. So a lot of our questions about, well, what should a 988 system look like, can and should be answered by this report, which may not be the be-all and end-all, but certainly will be the foundation of how it would look. And that's real important for there to be any designation in terms of further funds, I would imagine federally or from really any other source, because the question is, how much do you need and how much will it cost? I think will emanate in many respects from this kind of report that SAMHSA would provide to Congress. The third thing that the Designation Act would provide for is it's that the states, nothing would prohibit, and I want to be careful about the language because it doesn't in any way require or explicitly even encourage states to do this. It just simply doesn't discourage them from doing this. But this relates to fees that could be collected, in this case, from wireless bills, which is the way in which 911 is funded primarily, is through customer wireless bills. Some amount, maybe, you know, anywhere from a penny to a few dollars, who knows. That nothing would prevent a state from having the authority to levy a fee from the wireless bills for all wireless carriers servicing customers in their state, to go to a fund that would support 988 related services. And it describes what those 988 related services would be. It actually includes not only the crisis centers, but services that might respond to 988, such as, you know, perhaps mobile crisis teams or crisis stabilization services, that kind of thing. So it actually could lay the groundwork potentially for funding for a crisis services system. But let me just underscore the fact that this is not something that the states, even if they pass the legislation, which is the first thing, they have to pass the legislation. And secondly, the states would have to make the decision to do this. Many of them may not do so, may not be willing to do so, may not be able to do so. So it's not a sure thing, but in the event that they were able to and willing to do so, they could use it for, again, funding crisis centers that are responding to 988 and some responding services. So when Richard was talking about 988 transforming the system potentially like 911 transformed the emergency medical systems and responding law enforcement systems, that perhaps this kind of language that would suggest that states can and should be building out these services along these lines could be funded if this were passed, potentially by wireless bills, if the state decided to do that. The third thing is what they call dispatchable location. That section, essentially what we've been calling geolocation. As you know, most of the people that call the Lifeline, over 80%, are cell phone callers. So when we say we're going to route the caller to the nearest center in the network, we can't be sure of that because we don't really know where the caller is because of cell phones. So from a routing perspective, it's very sensitive to the Lifeline and important to our mission to really know where the caller is, at least generally, near a cell phone tower, at the very least, to be able to get them to the nearest center. Of course, in the event that there's a medical emergency where the response must occur immediately, we need to find the person. They're unwilling or unable to let us know where they are, and if we don't find them, that they could die. We absolutely would need to know their exact location. So this dispatchable location or geolocation permission naturally right now is given to permissions to 911, but not to the Lifeline. And so what this would require, again, is another report, this case from the FCC, within 180 days of the signing of the law, to determine how feasible giving 911-like permissions to 988 would be in terms of geolocation. So again, another report. This wouldn't require or create the potential for geolocation, but would enable a report to be written. There's another report that it requires, which is also very interesting and an important area of the Designation Act. And that is to address the needs of high-risk populations. Specifically, it notes LGBTQ youth. It mentions rural populations, it mentions minorities, or other high-risk populations. And the FCC really noted, I think, and underscored the plight of high risk related to American Indian, Alaska Native populations. So it would be required that for these populations, and it noted, I think, particularly LGBTQ youth, but in general, that they would require a report that SAMHSA would then provide 6 months after the passage of the Designation Act that would say, number one, how are you going to train staff members throughout the network to address the special needs of these high-risk populations, and in some cases transfer calls to trained personnel who are specialized in working with those high-risk populations, and or transfer to external organizations, and or provide some kind of IVR option or something that would enable smooth transition or access to these specialized service needs. And again, that's a report that SAMHSA would provide that would look at training and access issues to help provide specialized services for high-risk populations. So those are the ones I remember. I don't have it in front of me, but I think that's pretty much it. Richard, is that, can you?
I think you did a great job. I think you've covered each of the areas. So those are things that, certainly, should those bills pass and become law, we'll give you further updates on. But at least you know some of the key issues that are being discussed in Congress regarding this.
Richard, there's a little feedback on your line there. I'm not sure if it's feedback. It's just has a kind of a grizzled Darth Vader-ish tone to it.
I always sound like Darth Vader.
No, you usually sound like Frank Sinatra to me. But let's see if
we can move to some of the questions that I see have come in.
Sure.
Certainly. So I'm going to read these off by the order in which they came in. This first one has a couple of components, so I'll kind of break this up. First link shares, sometimes communication companies merge. How will this be monitored? Can we be assured that when someone dials 988, it'll be routed to the correct call center area? We have this issue with 211 sometimes where it goes to the wrong call center.
Yeah, so the key thing there is that, and one of the reasons that the FCC made the decision that it did, is that it's the structure of simply having the number 988 everywhere in the country point to the existing Lifeline number was far simpler than trying to figure out how to do this locally everywhere, with it being different everywhere. So the experience of a local center would be the same as it is now, although potentially with more calls in terms of the routing structure. So John, there.
And that's exactly right, Richard. And again, we're still getting that that odd tone on your audio. Sorry for the frustration on that.
Okay, so the next part of this question is also with the current Lifeline number, it is routed according to the person who is calling in and it's sent to their area code. Will there be a way to finally help this routing process?
Boy, do we hope so. I think this is the dispatchable location or geolocation issue, which really should be resolved as a result of this. That's the way, I put it this way: the FCC, who makes these decisions about 911 permissions and that kind of thing, we certainly have a good connection with the FCC, at least the current administration of the FCC. They are incredibly supportive of the Lifeline. And I imagine that there are some complications in the rule that enables us to have 911-like permissions where area codes are, it's no longer about area codes. It's going to be about actually where the person is calling from. Right now we use area codes, as you noted, and that's what's problematic. So it would actually take your GPS, like Uber, essentially. It would kind of know where you are and route you accordingly. That's the hope. But again, one, the Designation Act, if it passes, would require the FCC to study the feasibility of this and make recommendations to Congress, and we would hope act. And whether or not it passes, it's absolutely something that I know SAMHSA and we share as a priority to continue to push the FCC if we can.
All right, the next question comes from Mike Dunn, who asks, are there plans that would enable us to know if a call is originating from the Veterans Crisis Line?
You really shouldn't see any changes there. And I'm presuming that because a crisis center would only get a call originating from the Veterans Crisis Line if they were serving as a backup center to the Veterans Crisis Line, which I think is only Lines for Life, unless I'm misunderstanding the question. But access to the Veterans Crisis Line wouldn't change. Callers to 988 would hear the exact same message around press 1 for the Veterans Crisis Line.
It's an interesting question. And yes, perhaps if there are warm transfers from the Veterans Crisis Line, and that's kind of the nature of a warm transfer, it would be that I'm going to warmly warn you that, or inform you from counselor to counselor, hey, I've got this person on the line, I'm from Veterans Crisis Line. So warm transfers, we would hope, would be identified. There may be other ways, depending on what platform is utilized, that it would communicate that in an automated way to whoever's picking it up. And right now, as Richard notes, it's press 1 for Veterans Crisis Line. We don't know whether or not that will change, and if it does change, it would only change because the Veterans Crisis Line believed and agreed to the idea that there is a more ready way to access, or for veterans to access their line through 988. But for now, the way we understand things is really the way we see things now, and that is press 1 for Veterans Crisis Line.
This question from Stacy Williams says, we have 988 work groups in Missouri discussing upcoming changes and would love to have your expertise. Dr. McKeon.
Be glad to participate. And that I've been communicating with Bart Andrews, so we'll be glad to do that. And it's a benefit for us at SAMHSA to hear from states, to hear from your plan, about your plans, what you would like to see, what you're concerned about. That's very important input for us. So absolutely.
Stacy then also asks, is there any talk in requiring states to implement?
I think that, well, part of that would depend on what you mean by requiring a state to implement. Because every state and every community, in fact, all across the country, will be part of 988. So it's really a question of the extent of state engagement, of potential, whether states provide funding to the crisis centers that are answering the calls locally. You know, one thing that I would reference that's relevant, again, this is not law currently, but the president's FY 2021 budget did include a proposal to have the mental health block grant, which goes to every state, have a 5% set aside for crisis services. But that hasn't passed, and it is not specified 988.
I would add too, we are in the early phases of discussion, but we certainly want to help the states in working alongside the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors, who many of you all know has been a very close partner of the Lifeline since 2005. But working with them and state stakeholders to provide them with information and support for planning for 988. And so as we formulate how we're going to do that, we're going to give you some more information, but that's a priority. I mean, we want to help the states set aside the time and resources necessary to plan and start planning now, as soon as possible anyway, for 988. I'm glad to hear that Missouri's already started.
The next question comes from Eleanor Letcher. She asks, do you foresee any 988 funding cuts related to the current economic downturn?
Yeah, well, let me, so then there are two ways of looking at that. One is from a federal perspective, the other is from a state perspective. And we know that there are unique challenges to states now, but I couldn't comment on, what might be happening in any given state, although I know groups like the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors are actively, monitoring that. From the federal level, I think that SAMHSA is certainly extremely aware, and I think that there is significant congressional awareness around these issues. For that reason, SAMHSA, in the CARES Act that was passed, the first COVID package, there were $435 million in COVID-related funding that came to SAMHSA. And of that, $50 million was specific to suicide prevention. And those grants have recently been awarded. There were 50 grants, 800,000 each, including grants that went to to several crisis centers who are part of the Lifeline network. And also 2 supplements that went to the Lifeline, including an additional $5 million to support the disaster distress helpline. And, so I do not anticipate, and over the last several years, the Lifeline appropriation has risen from 7 million to 19 million. We would not anticipate cuts to that or to any SAMHSA suicide prevention program. What we don't know is that for the COVID-related funding, it is time limited in the way it's set up, so we don't know exactly what would happen at the end of that funding cycle in terms of whether that would continue. To date, there's been an increase in funding, a significant increase in funding at the SAMHSA level in response to COVID. As this, said, states obviously have their own challenges with their budgets.
Okay, the next question comes from Ron White, and he asks, do you envision 988 being text-enabled?
Well, this was a question that the FCC did look at as part of their process. They invited comments about that. The FCC decided to not incorporate texting into 988 at the present time. They did leave open the possibility that they might revisit that. But another development with regard to that is that SAMHSA did give, as part of the COVID funding, a supplement to Vibrant to increase chat services as well as to initiate a text pilot, precisely because what we were hearing from the field was that there were greater increases in chat and text than there were necessarily in phone calls, although there was variability in terms of increased phone volume. So the short answer is that no, 988 will not have a text function as part of the current order. That might well be revisited moving into the future, but it's not part of the regulation that was just passed, and it's not part of the 2-year timeline.
The next question is from Meryl, and she asks, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about routing calls. Do you anticipate keeping the current routing system, or are you considering changes?
Well, and again, it's hard to know because the infrastructure build for 988 is perhaps will be informed by the report that SAMHSA puts together for the Designation Act if it's passed. But in the meantime, and really ultimately, a lot of the decisions about the centers that would receive calls are going to be the ones that will be made by states for the most part. I mean, first of all, they have to be Lifeline centers. That's the one thing that appears to be kind of an unstated truth, because all calls would be going to the Lifeline network. And we certainly can determine who's going to be the Lifeline network, but what's also true is the states are going to determine who they're going to fund. And there's got to be uniform KPIs for performance across the network. That's really the reason for having a centralized network. That's why the FCC said, yeah, we should give it to the central administrator. So a person calling from Mississippi should have a similar experience as somebody calling from Minnesota. So whatever happens is the centers have to be able to perform up to a certain standard. That's all we care about. But what ultimately you care about, and what the states will care about, is how do you have the resources to meet those key performance indicators, and who is going to get funding, and that is something that the states will determine, and to the degree that they determine that, then that may determine routing, because if a center cannot manage its KPIs, then we can't keep the promise of 988. So it's kind of a convoluted way of saying we don't know, but what we do know is that states are going to have a strong influence on how the calls will be routed.
And in keeping with what you just said, John, Meryl asks as well, are there any current technology requirements that the Lifeline is recommending, as well as policy or protocol requirements?
That's a great question, Meryl. And, as a member of Standards Training and Practices Committee, you'll have a voice in that. I think there'll be a number of centers that will. And, really anything we establish will be, hopefully will be guided by our committees and of advisors, experts, researchers. You've seen a lot of the work that we've been doing over the years, the metrics document, which notes these are key performance indicators for crisis centers. And so, that is something that we'll need to be setting in with the advice and feedback from basically representatives of our centers on the committees. And also what SAMHSA agrees is suitable and reasonable. They would have to sign off on it as well. But we don't know exactly. But I mean, there's obviously some things that we know, like, for example, the Veterans Crisis Line cares about. The Veterans Crisis Line has a considerable amount of federal funding and are expected to answer calls in a very short period of time. So they have KPIs that they're required to meet related to things like average speed of time, percentage of calls answered, those kinds of things. There's some quality measures too that they're also required to maintain. That their experience will also help inform what we're doing, what we're going to recommend as well.
The next question comes from Lucinda Mercer, and she asks, let's see, we are a small center, budget under 400K with no governmental funding. If the volume is going to go up, we would probably need and want more funding. However, we don't really have the wherewithal to request government funding. Are there any thoughts on somehow helping all the centers in a state benefiting from increased funding collectively without having to go through a competitive grant process? Would it be helpful for us to contact our congressional representatives encouraging passage of the Designation Act?
Well, I cannot speak to your contacting any, local or congressional representatives, encouraging passing or any legislation. I do think that you have an important role in educating those in your community, your state officials and so forth about the 988 process if they're not aware of it and the implications for your state. And one line that was in the question says, is there any thoughts on somehow helping all the centers in a state benefiting from increased funding? Well, I think that's one of the key issues and one of the major points SAMHSA made in the National Suicide Hotline Improvement Act is that there needs to be increased call center capacity. And increasing call center capacity is going to need to increase, resources. So we are very aware of that and articulating, the need at SAMHSA. They said the Lifeline appropriation has gone from 7 million to 19 million. SAMHSA was able to use some of the additional COVID funding to provide some additional support. But we know that that is not going to be sufficient to meet the increased demand that's likely to build over time. If Lifeline call volume doubles or more than doubles, then that's not going to be enough, which is why we're looking not only at the Lifeline appropriation, but things like the mental health block grant and the potential crisis services set aside, as well as in state funding. And Lifeline has initiated a very innovative initiative in providing funding to states as kind of seed money to increase capacity within those states with the hope, which has so far been successful, that states will then pick that up. This started in Mississippi and the state of Washington, and then last year funds were given to different states. So we're very much hoping to engage states as partners in this. Of course, if states invest money in local centers within the state, they will have then an important role in decision making about where that funding goes. So there's probably not a single solution, but certainly we're very aware that there needs to be greater capacity than there is today in order to answer the call volume we anticipate 2, 4, and 6 years from now.
So in keeping with the time that we've allotted for the webinar today, we're going to wrap up, I think, with this one last question. And then, of course, if John and Richard have final thoughts to share it after that. This question kind of summarizes a lot of what we've been talking about today. Rachel Morrison asks, what can we consider crisis centers' next steps? What deadlines? What should they be preparing for?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things. I think that there are two things. One would be, I think you should use this as an opportunity to work with other partners in your community about what are the gaps in your current crisis system. SAMHSA recently published guidelines for behavioral health crisis services that talked about the importance of having the availability in every community, a crisis call center to serve as the hub of a more integrated system, mobile outreach services, and crisis stabilization units. So look at your own crisis centers along with partners in your community. Second, talk with folks in your state about how 988 should look in your state. We hope that 988 can play the same transformative role over time that 911 has. But that wisdom won't all come from Washington. That needs to come from the local level and from the state level, from people talking, realistically identifying needs, gaps, opportunities, et cetera.
I really agree with everything you're saying, Richard. I think it's so important to be engaging your crisis center partners in the state to the extent that there are other crisis centers willing and able to partner with you to discuss what shall we do, and share strategies together, and also making contacts at the state level with the key liaisons at the state level who would be involved with this, and perhaps a suicide prevention coordinator or others, and just say, we really would like to be a part of the planning process, and let us know how we can do that. So, extend the invitation for you to be invited into those conversations is really important. I would also say it's really important too, what a lot of the states are going to be going by are things like data. How do you make decisions when you have a number of things to balance? And often it's data that they'll look at to help them make a determination between this or that. That's what we all do. So, the data that you can show related to your effectiveness and what you can certainly provide to the Lifeline, in terms of, many of you have done such a fantastic job in responding to, for example, the recent imminent risk data requests. That kind of thing is really, really impressive to stakeholders who are wanting to kind of drill down and see, we're going to care about the data that you're providing. Give us examples of the data you're providing and what it means. And to the extent that you have it and you can interpret it in ways that are meaningful to them, then that's also going to help you with your relationship with them and their decisions about, well, this is a center that we can trust to work with to make sure that the quality of the service we provide locally for 988 is going to be viable.
And, I just note that there were several questions that came in on the Q&A that we didn't have a chance to answer. We will try to continue these conversations, but please, feel free to contact the folks at Lifeline. Feel free to contact me with questions, and with questions, with concerns, with opportunities. We'd love to hear from you on an ongoing basis. And let me conclude, because I know we're at the top of the hour, by thanking each and every one of you for what you do every day to prevent suicide in America.
I echo that. Thank you so much. And you all have a wonderful weekend, and we'll be in touch. Take care, and thank you again, all of you. And thank you, Richard.
Thank you, John.